Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know how we like to do things here. We want to get you the info you want without overwhelming. You're right. Get right to those aha moments. And well, today we're tackling two pretty huge pieces of the English learning puzzle.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you've pointed us to this Thinking in English and Mastering Pronunciation podcast, and it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
We're going to try to pull out some of those most practical tips, right, to help you actually use them to get past translating in your head and start speaking English more smoothly.
Okay, so first things first, let's talk about that challenge, right? Translating from your native language before speaking English. The hosts, SK and Perry Nor, they talked about why this happens. It actually makes a lot of sense. Traditional language classes, they lean pretty heavily on translation when they're teaching. And it kind of trains your brain to always take that extra step.
Yeah, and you know that translation step, it's helpful at first, but then it really starts to hold you back when you want to be fluent. You hear English and boom, you're trying to find the exact same phrase in your own language. It's like you always have to go through an operator when you're making a call. It just takes so much longer.
Exactly. So how do we get to that point where we're thinking in English more directly? Well, Perry and SK, they gave some great tips. And the first one is so simple. You can start doing it like right now. Just start labeling things around you in English. Look around your room desk lamp book. Just think of their names in English.
It seems basic, right?
Yeah.
But if you think about how your brain makes connections, you're basically making a shortcut between the actual thing and the English word. You're skipping over having to think of it in your native language first. It's almost like setting up a brand new phone line in your brain. The English word doesn't have to call your native language operator anymore. It's got a direct line to the object.
They also talked about keeping a diary in English. It doesn't have to be some masterpiece. Perry even said simple sentences about your day will do. It's all about getting used to making those thoughts in English, even if it's just in a relaxed, private way.
It's great practice for building sentences, too, and just getting comfortable expressing yourself in English, like a little testing ground with no pressure. You know, just you and the page.
Then there's speaking to yourself in English. It might sound a little strange at first, but just try narrating your day. I'm pouring a glass of water. Now I'm sitting down. It actually helps you absorb those words and grammar in real-life situations. You know, when I was learning Spanish, I used to do that, and I felt ridiculous. But it really did help me get those sentences right when there was no pressure.
That's a great point about the no pressure part. So many people are afraid to speak English even alone. This way you're building fluency without anyone judging you. You're getting comfortable using English naturally without even realizing it.
Pari and SK also said to try connecting English words with pictures instead of translating them. So like instead of learning cat as the word for cat in your language, just picture a cat in your mind. It cuts out that middle step of going through your native language.
It's all about our visual memory. It's super powerful. If you make a strong visual connection to the English word, it's like using a different part of your brain. It makes that word easier to remember, and you don't have to rely on translating it all the time. You know, it actually taps into something called dual coding theory. It's this idea that if you learn something with both pictures and words, your brain remembers it better. You're not stuck in that slow process of just using words.
Another thing they said was to start small. Don't try to make these super long sentences in your head at first. Start with simple phrases that you use a lot and build up from there. Baby steps, right?
It's like building a house. You start with the foundation and then slowly add more and more until you have this amazing structure. It keeps you from getting overwhelmed and make sure you keep moving forward.
And then, of course, they talked about surrounding yourself with English as much as possible. I mean, it sounds obvious, but the reason it works so well is that it forces your brain to think in English. When you're always hearing it, watching it, reading it, your brain starts to absorb all those patterns, and it just becomes more natural to think in English.
It's like you're retraining your brain to work in a new language. The more English you're exposed to, the more your brain starts to think that way. It makes thinking directly in English much easier, until eventually it's like second nature.
Okay, so we've got some great ways to shift over to thinking in English. Now let's move on to pronunciation. The podcast talked about how some English sounds are just plain hard because they're not in other languages.
Oh yeah, this is where a lot of people get frustrated. It's not just about knowing words and grammar. It's also about being understood clearly. And pronunciation, that's key. The podcast went over a few of those really common pronunciation mistakes that people make.
Oh yeah, like the T sound, everyone knows that one. People often say T or S instead. So think becomes tink or sink. It seems small, but it can really change what you're saying.
It all comes down to how we use our mouths. The P, you have to put your tongue in a certain spot, usually between your teeth, and breathe out in a specific way. If your native language doesn't have that sound, it feels totally weird at first, and it takes real practice to get it right.
They also mentioned the V and W sounds like very versus wary. Yeah, it's a tiny difference, but it can be confusing.
Yeah, and it's all on the lips and tongue. For the V, your top teeth have to touch your bottom lip just a little. For the W, you round your lips more. It takes a lot of practice to hear and say those right.
Silent letters are another big one, like the T and all. So that's classic English spelling, doesn't always match the sound.
It's so confusing. There's no easy rule for knowing when a letter is silent. You just have to memorize them or hear the words spoken over and over.
And then there's word stress. They said a lot of people mess that up. Saying photograph instead of photograph can make it hard for native speakers to understand, even if all the individual sounds are right.
Word stress is all about the rhythm of English. It's about making certain parts of the word louder. It's what gives it that natural flow. If you stress the wrong part, it can change the meaning or just sound strange. It's really important, but people don't always pay enough attention to it.
So how do we get better at all this pronunciation stuff? Well, Perry and SK has some good tips. The first one is to really listen to native speakers and try to copy them. It's not just hearing it. It's about really paying attention and trying to make the same sounds, the same intonation, the same rhythm.
It's about being active about it. Listen and then copy right away. Pay attention to everything, not just the sounds, but also how the words flow together, where they pause, what words they emphasize. It's training your ears to really understand the subtleties of English pronunciation.
They also talked about phonetic spelling, especially the IPA for tricky sounds. It might sound complicated, but it's actually a really cool system. It's like a universal way to write sounds. It shows you exactly how to say a word, no matter how it's written in English.
The IPA is a lifesaver for language learners, especially for those new words or ones that are hard to say. It takes the guesswork out of English spelling because sometimes the same letter can have different sounds. The IPA gives you one clear way to know how to say it.
And then there's tongue twisters. Remember that one they gave? 3 thin thieves, thought-thrilling thoughts. It sounds silly, but it really helps you train those mouth muscles. It's all about getting those sounds out clearly and quickly.
Tongue twisters are like a workout for your mouth. They help you get better at using your tongue, lips, and jaw together, so you can make those tricky English sounds more clearly and faster.
They also had a great tip about recording yourself and then comparing it to native speakers.
Hey.
I know it's weird hearing your own voice, but it's the best way to see what you need to work on.
It gives you this outsider's view of your English. Sometimes we think we're saying things right, but we're not. When you compare your recording to a native speaker, you can hear the difference and work on those specific areas.
Another tip was to break down those hard words into syllables. You know, those long ones that look impossible. If you just focus on one syllable at a time, it makes it way easier.
It lets you take it slow focus on each sound and then put it all together. Those crazy words suddenly don't seem so scary anymore. It's a much easier way to learn them.
And lastly, they even said that language apps can be helpful for practicing pronunciation. Technology is pretty amazing, right? You can give you instant feedback on how you're doing.
Some of these apps use really smart technology to analyze your pronunciation. They can tell you exactly what sounds you need to work on. It's like having a personal pronunciation coach right in your pocket.
Wow, so we've covered a ton today. All about thinking in English and how to tackle pronunciation.
And just like Parry said in the podcast, remember to be patient. It takes time and effort to get good at any language. Don't expect to be perfect right away. It's all about learning a little bit every day and getting better over time.
That's a great reminder. So for all of you listening, here's something to think about. We talked about some common pronunciation problems, but I want you to think about what sounds or words are hardest for you, and think about how those tips we talked about today can help you with those specific problems. You know, things like copying native speakers, learning the IPA, breaking down words. If you focus on those areas that trip you up, you'll see real progress, and you'll feel way more confident when you speak English. It's about taking those general tips and using them to work on the things that are toughest for you.
I love that idea. You know, it's like having a toolbox full of amazing tools, but it's not enough to just have them. You got to know which tool to use for the job, right?
Exactly. So find those English sounds that are your biggest challenges. Grab the right tool and get to work. Your English will thank you for it.
And your brain will too.
Yeah.
It loves a good challenge.
All right, that's it for today's deep